I would say I'm not used to that work.
Na clapiste leis no bushin.
Welcome back to Nuance, Not Difficult in Old Irish. This is the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. My name is Victoria Kriveshokova, and I'm an O'Donovan postdoctoral scholar here in the school. And today I'm talking to Dr. Daniel Watson, who is a Bergin Fellow in the school, and he will walk us through his Celtic studies journey, starting from his love of the Lord of the Rings, all the way to his research on medieval Irish philosophy, featuring Plato, angels, and transmigration of souls. Enjoy! Welcome to the podcast, Daniel. So first, we will start by talking a little bit about yourself. So you are one of the few international students at the school, and you come to us all the way from Canada. And you have quite an unusual background as a scholar. So you started out as a classicist, specializing in Platonic philosophy in Halifax in Canada. And here you are now, a Bergin Fellow at the School of Celtic Studies. So can you tell us a bit more about your academic journey and what attracted you to medieval Irish history?
I'll give it a try. Thanks for having me here. I think it goes back to when I was a child, really. One of the things that first started giving me the questions that would eventually drive me towards Celtic studies is it's a bit boring in some ways, but of course, Lord of the Rings, all those elves running around. Feeling that there's something real about all of this, despite knowing that it's fiction, and thus an interest in the stories which this must have been based on, that different medieval societies told about themselves. Another thing would be quite a dubious book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. Got questions in my head, when I was quite young about what the relationship was between ecclesiastical learning and the kind of learning we see represented in the saga literature. I was fortunate enough in my late teens to find a copy of Lady Gregory's Heroes and Fighting Men in MacLeod's bookshop in Vancouver. It was very hard to find actual sources on this sort of material these days. I didn't realize what a balderdized translation it was, and I was so relieved to finally have sort of found the sources. But things didn't really go beyond that for a long time because I didn't really know how to pursue the questions that I had, and I had sort of a vain hope that someday I would know enough to know how to pursue the questions that these kinds of texts and experiences created. It wasn't until the end of my master's research at Dalhousie in Halifax that I began to think I might have a way of going forward. This was studying the Neoplatonist Proclus, Diodocus, and his interpretation of Homer. One of the things interesting about his interpretation of Homer, that was new to me anyway, is that while interested in the allegorical interpretation of Homer, he wasn't interested in it at the expense of the historical meaning of the text. The stories of the gods certainly did mean something about the cosmos, but they are also on the kind of daimonic level, describe things that were actually happening at the same time as the soul could ascend to the gods as they were in mind or intellect through these sort of daimonic images. Anyway, the historical side of the sense that you could have a philosophical critique of poetry, and because you don't want divine beings acting badly, that reflects badly on the divine in this critique, that you could have this critique and still have historical gods, made me think, I wonder if something similar in a Christian context is going on in medieval Ireland. And this set me on the path to devising a program of research, which eventually turned into my PhD thesis, and revealed itself to be a question not specifically about the gods, though including it, but about the nature of philosophy in early medieval Ireland.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And it seems like you started with an interest in Celtic studies, then took a detour to classics, and then came back to Celtic studies. So you mentioned your PhD thesis, and so I think we will focus on it for the next few minutes. So you did it at Maynooth University, and it's titled Philosophy in Early Medieval Ireland, Nature, Hierarchy and Inspiration. And it is quite a monumental work. It comes in 2 volumes, and it is a very important contribution to scholarship, and it helps to redefine what we understand under philosophy in an early medieval context. So let's start with the basics here, maybe. So how do scholars usually define philosophy, and how does your approach differ from it? And what is early Irish philosophy?
Well, these are some very good questions. I'll do my best to answer them. I don't know if there's a way that philosophers usually define philosophy. This depends on the philosophical tradition a person belongs to. However, I think that the reason that philosophy hasn't been found in early medieval Ireland before has to do with an idea of philosophy that comes from another tradition being imposed on medieval Ireland. And they fail to find what they're looking for, and so determine philosophy isn't here. What I've been proposing is taking a page out of Laura Sterlasi's research in this, that we need a more historical approach to philosophy, that we shouldn't ask, can we find a philosophy we already understand in this given historical context? But when they speak about philosophy, what do they mean by it?
So I just was wondering, how does your approach to philosophy differ from maybe what people would normally understand as philosophy, in a more classical sense? And what do you think medieval Irish philosophy is?
Right. So the challenging thing in early medieval Ireland is there are some ideas coming that have their ultimate origin in philosophical texts from Antiquity, coming through and being repurposed and synthesized in various ways. And so it's not a wholly separate thing from what we think about as classical philosophy. It's related to it. However, the thing that's perhaps a bit tricky about it is that some of the same terms get used in different ways than we're used to. And there's a way in which a real classicist might associate with sophistry rather than philosophy, or have become a part of this vision of philosophy. That is to say, philosophy in this context isn't distinct from rhetoric or from law, among other things. There wouldn't be much to say about it if philosophy had simply come to mean all knowledge, because there's nothing to distinguish it against there. But this isn't the case in medieval Ireland. One thing I've focused on, well, firstly, is what do they say about philosophia or Felsefnacht, in distinction from theology or divine philosophy. And then, are there other kinds of terminology which seemed to be doing a similar kind of work? There's a significant amount to be said about the simple distinction between what's done with comparing and contrasting philosophy to theology, or mundane philosophy to divine philosophy. But there's the work I've been focused on is an analogy to this that you get in legal texts between natural law and scriptural law. It's defined in very much the same way, at the same time, in the same context, but there's considerably more said about it. And so my focus has been on what's said about how the natural law is known, what is the natural law, how is it different from the kind of knowledge that's thought to be revealed to the church, how does it work, and so on. I still haven't said much, I realize, about what I've found yet, but perhaps you might have something to say to kind of guide things in the way you want.
Yes, definitely. I think we will come back to natural law a bit later. But first, I wanted to talk a bit more about the sources. So you mentioned, of course, that you work with legal texts, and I know that you work with hagiography and exegetical texts as well. So as far as I understand, these texts, we cannot really talk about them as philosophical treatises, again, in the classical sense. So we don't really have anything surviving from medieval Ireland that is similar maybe to Platonic dialogues. So I just wanted you to talk a bit more about the kinds of primary sources that you use to explore the philosophical ideas.
Right. Well, most of the texts that I've been dealing with, in an early medieval Irish context anyway, are narratives. Narratives which present a kind of conciliation of various authorities on various subjects. This is part of the challenge, is that despite the fact you have dialectic being talked about in various early medieval Irish texts, you would be able to speak even more to that than I could. A lot of these texts seem to have the result of a kind of conciliation of authorities presented, already fully formed, rather than showing the process by which that synthesis is achieved. And I can't say that I've made much progress on that side of it yet. There's certainly, we have examples of disputes between people who are seen to have an authoritative sense of whatever sources they're dealing with, arguing and coming to a conclusion. However, it seems that very often in the sources that I've been dealing with, the truth is known not so much through a kind of syllogistic logic as through various kinds of signs that accompany the delivery. Some of this might be in the case of a poet giving a judgment in a form that's deemed to be rhetorically adequate. If it's not rhetorically adequate, it's not true. If you have just the form, it's also not true. If you're just regurgitating good form without it being really related to what's understood to be the truth, it's some kind of confluence of these. A royal judgment is often portrayed as being its truth or falseness detected through the state of the ruler's body or the kingdom, and so on. There seems to be a very direct relationship between appearance and reality when it comes to knowledge in this sort of context. There's an immediacy about what's true and what's not. It's immediately revealed in through sensible signs. And so there's clearly, this is presented as a way of telling what's true and what's not. But in terms of how you come to this, it's very often portrayed as a kind of inspiration. And here we might just seem to be back with, well, aren't we just talking about theology? No, if we're talking about inspiration. But the interesting thing is that the secular learned orders are portrayed as having a kind of inspiration that's comparable to that of the church, but distinct from it. And so what we would tend to expect in a medieval context is that secular learning would be distinguished from theological knowledge along the lines of theological knowledge, the knowledge that the saint or prophet might have is inspired. And then there's the knowledge that belongs to humans, and that belongs sort of more properly to the secular sphere, which isn't inspiration as such. It's not just using whatever powers we have in our nature. But in this situation, it seems much more common to secular inspiration and sacred inspiration, both from the Holy Spirit, but given in a different mode according to which hierarchies we're dealing with. I hope this is at least somewhat comprehensible in the way I'm saying it.
No, this is very, very interesting. And it sort of leads me to my next question, where I want to return back to the concept of natural law and its juxtaposition with the scriptural law. So these are kind of the central concepts in your thesis, and you use them. You use the concept of natural law to maybe understand how scholars in medieval Ireland were construing pre-Christian past as sort of an anticipation of the coming of Christianity. And you argue
Right.
that in this natural law, some revelations of the Spirit were already present, but maybe in a lesser degree than in the scriptural law,
Yes.
if I understand correctly. So I just wanted to ask you to tell us a bit more maybe about this idea of natural law. What is it? Where does it come from?
Well, that's a very good question. This was a big problem for me early on, because when I came across something that translates natural law, whether recht eichnid or lex naturae, I tended to think of I was more familiar before I got into all this with the high medieval context, where it describes vestigial capacity for ethics that remains to the soul after the fall, a capacity that's capable of identifying the difference between good and evil, but not sufficient to truly attain actual goodness. This is clearly what's not happening in a situation where the natural law is something that's not just a stump of what was human nature before the fall, but something revealed by the Holy Spirit, and something which seems to directly result in a much higher register of knowledge. I think part of what's going on in this is a kind of a synthesis of two different kinds of natural law tradition. One in which there's a kind of progression from natural law to written law to the law of the gospel, one might say, in which the natural law, it describes not the vestigial capacity for ethics that remains to the soul after the fall, but the inspired knowledge that was available to Adam before his fall, and the degree to which this survives into the future. And in the standard version of this model, as I understand it, the natural law is almost wiped out by the time of Moses, and the Mosaic law gives a way of kind of stirring up the embers of the natural law. And then finally, it's the gospel that allows it to flourish again. This model, though, doesn't really provide a way of distinguishing between people who are associated with the natural law from those who are associated with the kind of the scriptural law, because the scriptural law in this case is simply restoring the natural law. But we do have a kind of sense of it being something which is revealed by the Holy Spirit, and in proportion to the fitness of a person's nature to receive that inspiration. On the other hand, we have this other sense, which does distinguish more between the kind of knowledge that one might associate with the secular sphere and what one might associate with the ecclesiastical sphere. But in this case, it's distinguished along the lines of, the inspiration is on the side of theology, and just these powers that we just sort of have in us. There is a participation in grace still, but it's not like, to use Stoic terminology, it's in a sense what belongs to us as opposed to what comes to us from above, even though what belongs to us is itself a participation in grace. And so what seems to be happening in the early Irish sources, as I understand them, is a kind of synthesis of these traditions where, along with, Augustine and Jerome and various interpreters of them after the fact, there is a distinction between natural law and the kind of law associated with the revelation of the gospel. But like this other tradition of natural law that I was talking about, which you find, say, at the beginning of Eusebius' ecclesiastical history, in the letters of St. Anthony and Cassian, in some ways, I would argue, in the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitiones, among other places. From them, it takes this idea of the natural law being revealed through revelation, and through synthesizing these various authoritative traditions, they seem to be arriving at a doctrine of natural law which is in neither, but has the characteristics of both.
Yes. Thank you so much. It is very interesting how these ideas kind of develop and merge and come from different sources. I guess we can now focus a bit more on your more recent project that came after your PhD, which is a book project that you're currently co-editing. It's a collection of essays called Irish Platonisms, which traces the evidence for the presence of Platonic ideas in Irish intellectual culture from the early medieval period all the way up to the 20th century. So basically almost 1500 years, which is this is a very unusual approach in just the sheer chronological breadth. Mm-hmm. And so I was just wondering what you think the advantages of such an approach are, and what findings emerge from this book for our understanding of the development of philosophical ideas in Ireland.
Well, I think the principal use of this is that it shows that throughout known Irish history, there's an engagement with Platonism. Not always direct, not always the same form. It's not one tradition that's going all the way through. It's not one kind of reception of Plato. There's no attempt to show a single line going through the whole. But the important thing is that this engagement is always ongoing. And it's being carried out by people of very different backgrounds and commitments. The reason I think this is so important has to do with the ideological uses that scholarship, public opinion have often had for Ireland. There's been a tendency to see Ireland as a place that is not rational, either because it's beyond reason inherently, or inherently below reason. Either it's a place filled with mindless barbarism, a barbarism that justifies ambitious empires coming in and imposing law and order, or in a more sort of Rousseauian, sort of noble savage kind of sense, there's a tendency to see it as a place of a poetic or prophetic inspiration that's beyond reason. In short, it is very often historically, where people have been interested in the matter of Ireland, they've placed it outside of the city, as Aristotle would understand it, that among the beasts or among the gods, and not among humanity. And so one of the things that that most motivates me with this is not to try to say, oh, there's nothing different going on in Ireland. I think there is something different going on in Ireland. There's a lot of very strange and wonderful things to think about and discover in Ireland. But the true significance they have is as part of this larger conversation. Many of these contributions have been written off as irrelevant to this sort of fundamentally human conversation of philosophy, and seen as a kind of justification or adornment. And I'm extremely motivated to show that throughout Ireland's history, it's been producing thought that has to be wrestled with, and will reward us to wrestle with it. And however strange it may seem, has relevance for us wherever we're from, whatever our background is. We don't have to imagine ourselves to be a Celt, imagine ourselves to be anything in particular, to feel the significance of these texts.
Yeah, it's very important, and it kind of ties back to our previous discussion of how Ireland reinterprets maybe ideas taken from different traditions and creates a synthesis. And here as well, I agree with you that it is very important to understand what is happening in Ireland in the context of the broader developments in Europe, but at the same time to recognize when it is doing something different as well. And so I guess maybe focusing more on this part of your current research, tracing the influence of classical ideas in Irish intellectual culture, I was wondering, for example, for medieval sources, I know that our big problem is that the authors don't always tell us where they get their ideas.
Right.
What I'm wondering is, what is your method for tracing possible influences or ideas, and maybe what is the role of Christianity in this process?
Right. Well, I would say as for what's coming through from a kind of pre-Christian tradition in Ireland, I try to maintain what I hope is a healthy agnosticism. Because the first texts that we have come after some time following the conversion, it's very difficult. We have no texts from before, basically, to identify beyond a shadow of a doubt which things definitely did kind of come from before, and which things are introduced from the new learning that came with the church. So I've tried not to involve myself in that question. The thing that I've wanted to focus on is not what is the ultimate, does this idea have an ultimate source in something earlier in Irish history, something I can't know, but how does it make sense within this new Christian context? I think one of the problems that scholarship in this area has faced is that we too easily think we know what Catholicism is. We think, very often a person might have had an experience of catechism, for example, and assume that it's exactly the same sort of sense of the Catholic faith that someone in the 7th century has. Maybe even including things that weren't contained in that catechism as just belonging to it because of the kind of experience they've had of the church after that. It's very hard to resist assuming we know what orthodoxy is in that situation. And so the great difficulty is figuring out how is this working for them in terms of how they're understanding what authoritative belief about the faith is. How is this working for them? That's difficult to know sometimes because very often the sources they're using aren't directly referenced. And so sometimes you do have quotations, sometimes you do have direct references to this or that authority, and sometimes those references are correct. And that's great when they are. But a lot of the time, what a person has to do is cast the net very broadly as regards the sources that seem to have been available at the time. Unfortunately, a person can't get as nitty-gritty with this issue very often as what sources were in this library at this time, because sometimes we're lucky to get a text down to a 50-year period, let alone a clear sense of where it's from. So, a bit like Plato says of the Timaeus, that a lot of the time the best we can do is a likely story. And so a lot of what I would do is look around in the sources that seem to have been available, and what seems like what seems like a possible or probable basis for the way they're developing a certain idea, and look around at the other texts that seem there's a similar case, and just try and figure out among the sources that tend to be popping out, how do they seem to be putting it together. That's a bit frustrating, of course, not to be able to say more than that, but until a person comes up with some kind of narrative about how it's fitting together, no doubt future generations of scholars will be able to improve on it and refine it, but a person has to take the risk of sort of getting in there and just trying to say something about it as clearly as possible, and hope that a person will live to see many people refine that story in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this answer. And I think I can see, having read parts of your thesis, at least, I can see how you always try to offer such a deep inquiry into what the possible sources might be, and offering so many different opportunities and how they could have come to Ireland, and how these ideas keep popping up in different places. And so still maybe sticking with this discussion of Ireland having access to all these sources and working with them in a way that is maybe unique to itself, but also in a way that is within the context of the contemporary intellectual developments in medieval Europe. I'm wondering if do you find that the way that Irish scholars engage with maybe ideas from classical philosophy or patristic philosophy differently in any ways than what we find in other medieval cultures at this time?
Well, I would say there's certainly novel ways that the sources are put together. I wouldn't say, honestly, that I know enough of what's happening in Merovingian France or in Visigothic Spain to answer the question in a very satisfactory way. It seems clear that they see the various patristic sources and councils as authoritative, but also that there's a great deal of intellectual confidence about interpreting these things and coming to perhaps surprising conclusions. One interesting thing that comes to mind is in the early 8th century Collectio Canonum Hiberdensis. There's a section in it on the soul, and there's a place where it quotes St. Jerome on the soul. The way St. Jerome is quoted, I forget which letter it's quoting, it's as if St. Jerome is just listing various perspectives on the soul without offering any criticism of the Platonic and Origenist view, as it's listed, that the soul came into embodiment like falling from heaven. It's just sort of presented as another option. It's part of what often seems to show a writer fit to interpret is their ability to interpret with a degree of creativity. That's the first thing that comes to mind anyway. You'll have to bring me back to the path to remember where we're coming from.
Oh no, it was just a question about maybe the unique features of the Irish intellectual method compared to other medieval intellectual cultures. But I do agree with you. I find it a lot as well that Irish scholars, they tend to offer such a broad range of possibilities for any given question. It seems that they're really interested in understanding a topic in as many ways as possible.
Yes, I would go so far as to say that I often come across what I would describe as a proto-scholastic mentality, a desire to be, well, very conscious of the full range of authoritative opinion, and sometimes to present it as a conflicting range of opinion without necessarily resolving it. Certainly, one has to guess it's for the sake of some various kinds of future resolution. But yes, obviously there's something that happens later with scholasticism that hasn't happened before. But, there's no doubt many different things leading to that moment which haven't been properly appreciated. And one of those seems to me to be this material we find in early medieval Ireland, which is especially valuable in showing us a kind of alternative. It's not that it's completely separate, but a kind of alternative to the program of educational reform in the Carolingian Empire, perhaps giving us a clue to what was going on in other places before that great project, and the kinds of continuity that may very well have existed in other places, but we don't have records.
This is all very interesting. And I guess so far we have been as you said, we were talking about the more underappreciated areas of Irish intellectual culture, and also mostly about anonymous texts. And we don't really know much about the specific people who composed them. But now, if we move on to your current project as a Bergin Fellow here at the school, it focuses on John Scotus Erugena or Erugena, who is probably in contention for the title of the most famous Irishman of the Middle Ages, probably besides St. Patrick. So, and he is really a named entity that we know quite a bit about. So maybe for listeners who are not too familiar with him, who was he and why is he held in such a high esteem by modern scholars?
Well, I'll just say a very brief bit, as it's relatively easy to find out about him. He's a scholar of Irish origins who spoke Old Irish as well as Latin, who moved to the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century to the court of the invitation of Charles the Bald, the then emperor of the Carolingian Empire. And he was not the only Irish scholar there. There's quite a few of them, even in his own time. And there seems to be a certain association of Irish scholarship with great learning in various sources. But he stands out simply for having done something almost unbelievable. It's not that his earlier work, unfortunately I don't know his earlier work very well besides his work in divine predestination. He somehow, based on whatever he knew before, when he encountered the corpus of the works attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, he was able to, interpret them first, but then based on this engagement with the works of Dionysius and various other Greek patristic sources, Maximus the Confessor, for example, he, without really knowing many ancient, sort of straight up, sort of pagan Platonic sources very directly, seemed to reconstitute ancient Neoplatonism through this multitude of indirect sources. And an amazing and unbelievable achievement. The great question is, of course, how much of the learning which allowed him to do that did he learn at the Carolingian court? How much did he bring with him from Ireland? Clearly, there's a lot going on at the Carolingian court in terms of various kinds of learning, encountering various kinds of texts. We also know that there seems to be a reason that Irish scholars are being invited to a court like that. But we're only just beginning to understand what that learning would be. So one of the long-term goals is trying to figure out what is it that he's bringing with him. How is his work informed by the education he had in Ireland? But in the meantime, I'm trying to get around that issue by looking at an example of the reception of his great work, the Paraphysion, in Ireland in the 12th century. In this, my work would be building off of some amazing articles by Pádraig P. O'Neill. This text seems to have begun in Glendalough and ended up around Newry. Likely, the manuscript is in part of a kind of like a book that an itinerant scholar who wandered around teaching would be taking with them. And so for the moment, I'm trying to avoid the question of what is Irish in Erigena's philosophy by looking at what people in Ireland made of his philosophy in Ireland. And of course, the learning of the Irish scholars involved is not just from here. It's hypothesized that at least one of the people involved was educated at Chartres in France, and that the beginning of the ideas that sort of find themselves in this manuscript come from there. But the fact that it circulated here and was seen as relevant to the education of people here is a very significant thing. And the thing I'm looking forward to most here is not simply making an edition and translation of this this version of his Paraphysion as it existed in Ireland in the 12th century available, but looking at the interpretation of his work that's implicit in the selection of texts from the Paraphysion in the summary of it, because it's made of selections of text and paraphrases. And so this is always going to involve interpretation. So this is the goal, and it's hoped that because he has such a high name recognition, that this kind of project will help people to be at least more open to the idea that philosophy exists in early medieval Ireland, even in some of the most sympathetic sources, like say Thomas Duddy's History of Irish Philosophy. There's a kind of gap between Erich himself and early modern Ireland, and so it seems of the utmost importance to draw attention to what's happening in Ireland in these hundreds of years between. I would want to argue a lot, but it's so little known at this point, and it's certainly no part of how the Irish past tends to be reflected on. Very often philosophy seems to be seen as a foreign imposition, rather than something that's been with Ireland so long as it's been producing texts. So,
yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting, all of your projects and how they all circle back to showing how Ireland was really, in the ways that it is maybe unique among other medieval cultures, but it was still very much on the same footing as them, and it was not, a mythical, magical place.
We're not only so.
Yes. So maybe now let's talk about more maybe general things that we usually ask all our guests on the podcast, starting with, of course, your average working day. I'm sure many people would love to know what it's like to work on this kind of material. It seems to involve so much work and trying to make connections between all these stages of philosophical thought. So what do you usually do when you work on your research?
Well, I wouldn't say there's an average working day, because it tends to be focused around projects. And of course, in the Institute, there's a responsibility to participate in various seminars for the course of the year. That's part of the mandate of the Institute, which involve various translation seminars in Celtic languages, Old Irish, Middle Irish, Medieval Welsh, and I think, and on occasion, Hiberno Latin. So a significant part of work here during term is frantic attempts to come up with a good translation that will save you from infamy when it comes time to present it in front of the other scholars. And that's a great part of the tradition here has been just making sure that there's the necessary expertise in language and in reading manuscripts to really figure things out. And now more than ever, because this kind of expertise very often isn't well supported by modern presidents of universities. So it's all the more important what Dias is providing that way. In terms of my own research, it depends greatly on the kind of project. When I'm trying to do a research project, like come up with a new paper, there's a lot of just trying to read as broadly as possible, trying to figure out, is there any kind of pattern here? If so, what is it? And then attempt to write up some sort of a form of it, which seems like it might be, one might finish it quite a lot faster than one actually will. And then there's the process of discovering problems with everything you've come up with at every step. I said the hardest part of the focus has to do with one of the greatest advantages we have at the moment, the availability of sources through the internet and other like things. Because there's so many things you can check with now, it can be hard to confidently move forward or to know when you've exhausted, to be confident you've exhausted all of the available avenues of research that would allow you to say, yes, this is my conclusion. And of course, it takes a lot of focus just to not forget what you're doing when you're going around through like 5, 6, 7 different things, and you have, 10 PDFs open, and you're trying to remember why you have this PDF, and so on. I would say one important thing to say about the work here is it's not a normal job. It's kind of like running a marathon, because both in terms of our mandate, we have to produce research that's interesting and significant for the state. But also, personally, I'm hoping for a permanent job at some point. And so on both sides of that, I need to produce as much meaningful research as possible. But of course, I have to live as a human being. And so it's one of the big questions about how to pace yourself. Because if you leave the whole human aspect of life out entirely, you won't produce good research. But then if you're afraid of kind of buckling down and going to extremes, if you're afraid of ever doing that, you'll get nowhere. So I'd say that's one of the main challenges, is trying to figure out what kind of intensity is necessary in the moment, and how to do that sustainably in order to create research that's valuable to Ireland and creates a hopeful future for myself, right? So, does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. And I think a lot of scholars will be able to relate to this constant struggle of finding the right balance. But definitely, I would say you have been very successful at it, and your hard work pays off in your publications. So that's what I wanted to talk about next. So one of your recent publications is an article in Celtica, so the school's journal, on the topic of metempsychosis. Yes. Which sounds very exciting. So I just wanted to ask you to tell us more about this article and any other publications that you're proud of, including maybe some of the forthcoming ones.
Well, I'll do what I can. So metempsychosis is just a Greek word that describes the, perhaps another mouthful, the transmigration of souls. The idea that when you die, your soul goes into another body rather than going into some kind of beyond, and continues to go through a series of bodies through the history of the world. The reason I was bringing this up with medieval Ireland is because one thing that's a bit surprising is that there's various stories of people becoming re-embodied as various animals, and sometimes other things, before being re-embodied as a human again. This has caused, in some scholarship, has made some people want to draw a connection between medieval Ireland and the things which were said about the Gaulish Celts by Julius Caesar and various people of Antiquity, likening the Celtic Druids to the Pythagoreans and so on, and say, here we have confirmation in Ireland that this is true, that this kind of similarity to the Pythagoreans survived in Ireland into medieval Christian Ireland in the 7th century and onward. And so the article was an attempt to look at this and to see, well, is this a credible claim? If so, how so? If not, why not? There's a few other stories besides the story of Mongán Fiachna that a person has to consider with this. But most of them end very tidily, in that it's very clear that it's through a divine miracle that their life has been preserved in these various shapes. And it's for the purpose of medieval the medieval Irish ecclesiastical establishment having a sense of the history of Ireland. This revenant has been preserved from the past so that they can have an authoritative sense of what happened before. So it is still remarkable, but there's no sort of problems of, okay, we have the Christian idea of the resurrection of the body at the end of time. There's no problems with which body is the person's body if they get their a human body back by the end. The tricky thing with Mongán Fiachna, well, there's a couple tricky things, a lot of tricky things. One of them is that he's not someone who's thought to live in the ancient past, but he's in the annals, a prince of the Christian era. The other thing is that there's no indication of if or when his embodiments are going to stop. And the conclusion I came to in this particular paper is that what's going on here is that he's actually seen more as one of the gods who often appear in the sagas than he is a human. That he's one of the. They don't use this language, if I remember, in the specific text, but he's Shiva, the Tuatha. He's one of them fundamentally, and just is embodied as a human sometimes, as opposed to a human who sometimes embodies other things. And therefore it's not the problem the same way, because the beings of this other world are very often presented as surviving in this kind of ever-living state until the end of time. And what's not natural for us is it was presented very often as natural enough for them. So that's the short of it. I've got one coming out on the reception of Orosius, a student of Augustine, the reception of his historiography in a Middle Irish text. Part of what's sort of exciting about this one is it seems that he's being drawn on very creatively in a way that seems to envision Ireland as being a kind of successor to the Roman Empire, which will in some way be a sort of a foreshadowing of the eschatological kingdom of Christ at the end of time. This sort of sense that empire is moving west. This part isn't Orosius himself so much as Augustine. This sense that empire is moving west, and well, Ireland happens to be a little bit further west, if you haven't noticed. And so clearly, it's coming here. And here's another interesting thing. Like, I don't think people tend to be amused when they think of someone in the 12th century in Ireland thinking about a world historical empire potentially getting set up there. But we have to remember that aspirations to such things don't demand a political context, which is necessarily going to realize it in order for this dream to be there. And some of the texts in the Carolingian context, or not a Carolingian context, but what was going to be a Holy Roman Empire sort of context, but before that comes together under Otto, some of the texts which are strongest on this kind of idea of, successors to a Roman Empire having an eschatological significance are at a time where it's of great chaos, when no one knows what's going to happen or if things are going to come together. So that's one thing. And I think I've been talking a while in answer to this question, so I'll let you come back to me and see if you want me to speak more about anything on that.
Yeah, well, this was very interesting. I think both articles will be very interesting to listeners as well. So I'm very glad that you talked about it. But maybe, I guess the next logical question would be to ask you if you have any plans for the future, any specific research topics that you would like to pursue, which maybe would also tie to some of your forthcoming publications.
Well, I'll try to answer as best I can. The main thing is the book I'm currently working on editing that you mentioned before, Irish Platonisms, for Bloomsbury. It's coming very close to completion now, and that's really the biggest thing I have going at the moment. And then this following that, the next big project is this one you mentioned on the 12th century Irish epitome of Eriganus Perphysion. Once Irish Platonism's away, there's a number of smaller projects that have been neglected for some time. One looking at the understanding of number in early medieval Ireland and the reception of Boethius, work by Boethius on mathematics. There's quite a bit left with to do with Orosius and so on. One thing I'd like to focus on in the near future is more some more popular work on just trying to explain why early medieval Irish philosophy Why is it interesting? Why do we want to know about it? How is it not just an echo of what is done better elsewhere? Because it is not just simply an echo of what's done elsewhere, but the word needs to get out. Oh, well, yes, well, there's some more to do with this question of re-embodiment that's still in the offing. I think there needs to be an article about, which I think is mostly ready, on punishment, divine thunderbolt, and the reception of Orosius in early medieval Ireland. Also, just looking at examples of things that might seem heterodox to us, but are orthodox within a medieval Irish situation, to just try and get that conversation going a bit more, because I think we're still I think assuming too much that they're trying to get away with things. What they're doing is very interesting, but it seems there's very little basis for thinking that they're going against orthodoxy as they know it. Say, for example, a councillor under Zosimus, I've forgotten the exact date of it, but basically, nowadays, how if you try to name angels, you're going to probably name 3 or 4. You got Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and maybe Uriel. But there's a council at one point that said you can only name 3, and the rest is very dangerous. But then in the life of St. Patrick, you have Victor, the angel, is the writer of a hagiographical tale of St. Patrick, which was just trying to promote the importance of Patrick in ecclesiastical context, trying to be kind of sneaky and bad about, I'm going to call an angel a name. Clearly not. There's a lot to look into. Anyhow, it probably sounds a bit ridiculous what I just said, but it's I think it deals with serious enough issues. How is a hagiographical tale that names angels, that at least come in a way that comes not to be seen as the right thing? How is it engaging with the larger conversation? Is there that expectation early, or is it only under Pope Zosimus? Was Pope Zosimus' decree widely received, or did it stay fairly close to home? Anyhow, that's a bit of a wandering around the barnyard there, but I'll leave it at that.
Oh, but it is very interesting, and I'm sure you shouldn't be worried about spreading the word about the importance of early Irish philosophy, because you're already doing it right now, and I think you're capturing people's imaginations. And so maybe then, as just the final thing, what are the things that captured your imagination? So what are maybe some of the most important books or articles on the topics of Irish philosophy or Platonism or other topics that we talked about today that inspire your research, that listeners can look up and read if they are interested in these topics?
Well, certainly the most important one for me was an article written by the scholar who's going to become my supervisor. It's by Elizabeth Boyle, written in 2009, called Neoplatonic Thought in Medieval Ireland, The Evidence of Scéala na Airseaga. It's in Medium Avum 78. That was the work which suggested to me that there was scholarship going on that could be a link for me between the work I was doing on ancient Neoplatonism and early medieval Ireland. And one of immense significance for me. I would say, there's a lot of shout-outs I would love to give at this point. I would say one of the best things, if you're just generally interested in medieval thought, this isn't specifically to do with Ireland, but if you want to feel like a genius and you really are you're really getting it about medieval mentality, I would strongly recommend Erwin Panofsky's Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism. You won't regret it. It's brilliant. This is the kind of writing that I would aspire to down the road. Hopefully by the time I'm old, maybe I can write like that. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but I'd definitely recommend Kim McCone's Pagan Past and Christian Present. It's it's a bit wild. It's uneven. I'd say it's a very important work, many important arguments in there, not all of them substantiated. And there's some things that it's harder to know what's going on there. But it's inevitably a place where a person's going to encounter a lot of interesting thoughts about texts that are relevant to these things. For me, I already mentioned Laura Sterlesi as one of my most important. He's very important for medieval philosophy generally, but especially his approach to understanding philosophy more historically. What does philosophy mean in this context, rather than trying to find what we already know philosophy to be in that context. For a specifically Irish context, I'd say a lot of the most meaty work has been done by Pádraig P. O'Neill. There's a number of articles there. One of the inspirations behind my project for this edition, translation, and commentary on this Irish text of Erigena is this Irish epitome of Erigena is by Michael Harrington. He came up with this amazing edition called A 13th Century Textbook of Mystical Theology at the University of Paris, The Mystical Theology of Dionysius the Areopagite in Erigena's Latin translation. And so rather than leaving us with a critical edition, which, we don't really know who had a text that's how close or far the text people are. Well, let me explain more clearly. When you pick up a edition, it's very often a normalized text that's like the best possible text, a representation of what the original version is imagined to be. But in a given place and time, people don't necessarily have that text. They have, something else. And so this was an attempt to recreate what did they have at the University of Paris when they're studying Dionysius. And so you can actually say concrete things about it. Very exciting stuff. We need many more editions like this. I think we're looking forward to a new edition of a similar text from him in the next year or so. But then also there's a few, I don't want to keep you too long here, but there's three works I need to mention because they're the best overviews we have of the history of Irish thought and were an inspiration for my Irish Platonisms book. We have Thomas Duddy's A History of Irish Thought, 2002. We have Susan Gottlieb's Philosophy in Ireland, Past Actualities and Present Challenges. And we have Richard Kearney's The Irish Mind, Exploring Intellectual Traditions. I'm hoping to achieve things that are with Irish Platonisms that are new, that haven't been done by these. But it's definitely a situation of dwarves standing on the head of giants. They've done a huge amount of the work, and I'm just trying to sort of see a bit farther than they have by standing on their heads.
Well, yeah, that's a very exciting list of readings, which I'm sure many people will be interested in checking out at least some or all of those things. But I guess that's all the questions that I had for you. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and telling us all about your very exciting research.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Ní Ansa, the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. If you're interested in learning more about today's topic, check out the description below. And for more information about the school, you can go to dias.ie.